G'day YouTube, Warble's on a lot here. 23rd of April, day before Hitler's birthday, 2 days before Anzac Day. And Australia has gone the full war crimes Wehraboo. You know what a Wehraboo is? It's a word that derives from the Wehrmacht, the German military forces, all of them. Army, the Heer, Navy, the Kriegsmarine, Air Force, the Luftwaffe. The Wehrmacht are considered by some today to have been an absolutely unbeatable, highly professional, elite force of apolitical soldiers who never did anything wrong. All of the war crimes of the Nazi regime were obviously done by the Totenkopf division of the SS, the Death's Head division of the SS, or the political division of the SS. And in Germany, these individuals, the people who make endless, unqualified excuses for all of the Wehrmacht, they're called Wehraboos. Basically, they hold that their national honour is such that none of their troops could ever have done anything wrong collectively, but that there were a few bad apples. And the bad apples were all concentrated in one little tiny mob. And that one little tiny mob bears all of the odium of everything that was ever done by anybody who wore the uniform. Wehrabos. Here in Oz, we've been involved in fighting one of America's stupid bloody wars for 20 years, the one in Afghanistan. Australia trying to occupy the graveyard of empires. And we have a volunteer defence force. So although units were deployed to Afghanistan, individuals had the choice. Do you want to deploy or not deploy? And if you deploy, you get paid a lot more money. Bonuses for agreeing to go, plus a daily combat area pay rate, scale, levy, compensation, danger money, whatever you want to call it. You'd make a lot of money by agreeing to go to Afghanistan for 6 months. Some people went 6, 8, 9 times over 5, 6, 7 years. And the job was undoable. The government in Canberra was committed to support the government in Washington, and the government in Washington was bogged. They had invaded and attempted to occupy a country that never, ever attacked America. But Osama bin Laden was staying there. He had been staying there ever since he went there to volunteer to help Uncle Spam and the Mujahideen to dislodge the Soviet puppet government in Kabul. Back in the days when Osama bin Laden had been on the front cover of Time magazine twice, and they spelled his name, Osama bin Laden, because they liked it. It's apparently an alternative spelling for Osama, and it's perfectly legitimate. But he was an American hero. Anyway, he's supposed to have sponsored 19 people, I think 14 Saudi Arabians, and most of the rest were Jordanians, and there was a Portuguese among them, who couldn't land a two-seat Cessna, who somehow used box cutters to gain control of passenger airliners and fly near velocity of maximum controllability, spiral dives, terminating 2 of the aircraft into 2 buildings, which then caused 3 buildings to spontaneously fall to the ground. Therefore, America invaded Afghanistan, because the Taliban, who were the United Nations recognised government of Afghanistan after they'd been formed as the surviving group of the Mujahideen, who'd been funded by the CIA to take over Afghanistan, to get rid of the Soviet puppet government in Kabul. America invaded Afghanistan to get rid of the Taliban because they wouldn't hand over Osama bin Laden. And because Australia likes to play Uncle Spam's pet attack train chihuahua, we offered to go in there before America did. Oh yes, we'll support, you know, you've got a broad international coalition, Australia wants to be there. So, as is fairly usual in an occupation in the middle of bloody nowhere at the end of an enormously long logistical pipeline, the occupying force gets to camp in fortified enclaves and walk around pretending to own the place during the day, but at night time the locals own it. And the locals rise up and defend their homeland out of a sense of nationalism, bugger the ideology. They just don't want armed foreigners clod hopping around their patch of the planet. And I'm going to draw an analogy here between the people in Australia who live in towns and cities and suburbs and villages who own a firearm and who want to go and do something honourable and noble with the firearm, like reducing the population of noxious, invasive, feral, pestilential animals. Rabbits, cats, foxes, pigs, goats, deer, horses, camels, bison. These individuals make sporadic forays out into the hinterland. Now, the civilian example I'm painting for you, these are the people who have a gun, but they don't know anybody on whose land they are permitted to hunt. They can't go on public land like travelling stock reserves. They need lots of licenses and permission to go into state forests, generally not allowed to hunt in national parks. So they drive out around the secondary and tertiary road network, the little unpainted bitumen roads and the dirt roads. And they go out there at night and they get to the extreme range of half their fuel tank and most of their booze, and then they turn around and they come home. And on their way back home, when they haven't found any what they consider legitimate targets, an actual feral animal that lives wild and it's stupid enough beside the road to stand still in the headlights of a vehicle that slows down and stops. So they've got nothing to shoot in their mind legitimately, but they're out there and they've taken the risk of being armed and locked and loaded and on a public road, and they want to shoot something. Some of them on their way home simply can't resist the temptation to shoot at something, anything. They have to test their marksmanship. They have to prove to themselves what great warriors they are by shooting up the landscape, attacking the poor bloody road signs in the middle of the night when they think nobody's watching. And that's what their great, honourable, noble, armed defence of the broadacre agro cult of harvest everythingism has dissolved into. Mindless vandalism, shooting up the landscape, trying to blow holes in the road signs. But of course there are worse, out beyond the bounds of the more civilised parts of the country. Some of these self-appointed, self-righteous guardians of the cult of harvest everythingism, they actually start shooting up the livestock to the point where once you get about 10 miles further west from here, a lot of people won't risk putting livestock in a paddock beside the road because there is a subculture among Australia's gun polishers who figure that if they go out into the boonies with their gun, they feel they are entitled to shoot something and make it bleed. Well, it seems that those are the sort of people who are perhaps a bit unemployable within the economy, and maybe they join the military service because it's a job, it's a regular way of earning their living. And perhaps, and some of them, they'll shoot the sheeples when they happen to be fed up and fucked up and bored and frightened and in a far off foreign land playing hopscotch among the minefield, never known who's going to tread on the next booby trap because improvised explosive devices are for people who don't like being boobies. And apparently, whereas the bored townies relieve their tension and their anxiety and their nervousness, worried about whether they're going to get caught shooting illegally from the road by plugging the road signs and killing the sheep, over in Afghanistan, some of our elite special forces have been relieving the anxiety and the tension and the boredom by shooting the local population when they couldn't find any actual terrorists to unload their weapons on. So, there's the analogy between all of the people who live in town and go surreptitiously shooting in the countryside at night from the roadside, and only some of them shoot at road signs, and only some of them shoot at the livestock. But it's not as if the shooting of road signs and the shooting of livestock is not noticed. And the people who live in that area or who work in that area, they notice that some of these midnight gun fanciers are doing a whole lot more damage than they're doing good when they go out to save the world from feral animals. So, during a 6-year inquiry, a professional justice of the federal court, a bloke by the name of Brereton, a Colonel Brereton in the Army Reserve, spent 6 years investigating reports of Australian Army war crimes, torturing and murdering civilians as well as prisoners. I mean, enemy combatants who were captured and then murdered, civilians who had nothing to do with the fight who were tortured and murdered. Stories of this behaviour were making it back to Australia via the psychologists and the psychiatrists who were attempting to treat the traumatised Australian Army veterans who'd been there and seen it happening. And the pressure had built up so that there was a 6-year inquiry, and Colonel Brereton submitted his report. In November, the Chief of the Defence the Chief of the Defence Forces, General Angus Campbell, announced that about 25 people had either participated in or had perpetrated or had observed the perpetration of war crimes. As a result, Brereton had recommended and Campbell had agreed to accept the recommendation that an entire squadron of the Special Air Services was to be disbanded forthwith because it was just too riddled with corruption and death junkies. Another squadron was to be heavily weeded out. And there was the recommendation that because meritorious unit citations are handed out to entire units which have uniformly conducted themselves well, laudably, so well under a stressful, prolonged combat situation, even though they may not have been getting shot at. The laundry assistant for the Special Air Services, the bloke who peels the potatoes and washes the dishes in their cookhouse, gets a meritorious unit award for having been there. The unit gets a citation. Everybody gets a little patch of fabric to sew on their chest to say they were there. Brereton took the view and Campbell accepted the fact that it's not possible to say that everybody in the unit conducted themselves laudably and with aplomb when there was so much murderous war criminality going on that members of the unit were going back to Australia and having psychiatric breakdowns because of the trauma of having watched what other Australian service personnel were doing with their combat pay and their Australian taxpayer-funded weapons and uniforms and radios and helicopter rides and all the rest of it. You can't say, oh, well, nobody knew, because, yeah, people knew, people were being driven mad by it. So therefore, 3,000 people who were there over a 6-year period in the units concerned were to lose their meritorious unit citation. And initially, Scott Morrison from marketing, the leader of the Parliamentary Liberal Party and therefore the Prime Minister of Australia, initially he backed the Chief of the Defence Forces. Yes, okay, that's what we're going to do, we're going to do. And then the Liberal Party propaganda wing went bananas. All of the people who had been somehow pegging their definition of humanity on goes to war and comes home a bemedalled hero went off their little heads. People whose children, partners, fathers, siblings, mothers perhaps. I don't think we had any mothers killed in Afghanistan. But anyway, not Australia. People who had lost family members and close friends, they went ballistic as if it was somehow more of a terrible tragedy and a shame that the government had recognised that this unit doesn't bloody deserve a meritorious unit citation because they shut their mouths. They looked the other way. Oh, I don't want to see any evil. I don't want to hear any evil. I don't want to speak any evil. The three monkeys of corruption were rife within the Australian Special Forces, sucking up the money on the gravy train of wandering around Absurdistan looking for a terrorist and sometimes shooting a villager. A teenage, retarded goat herd. One of them, and they videoed it, and they come home and they put it up on the bloody Facebook. Oh, look what we did, aren't we, patriots? Okay. Well, back in November, Campbell said, Brereton said, we are going to court-martial the people that we think we might have a chance of convicting. It's going to be very difficult to convict them, but we're going to try. Meanwhile, to make sure that this never happens again, we're going to take away the meritorious unit citation so that everybody in the unit knows that if anybody in the unit commits a war crime, they are all going to lose their meritorious unit citation. And you do this to set a precedent. It's like when somebody robs a bank, you don't send them to jail in order to stop them from robbing another bank. You send them to jail so that everybody in the community who was ever tempted to rob a bank gets the message that, not much point robbing a bank because you only get 300 yards down the road or maybe 2 years down the calendar. And they catch up with you and they put you in jail and your life turns to shit. The idea was to send a message to everybody else in the Australian Defence Forces that if you are going on secondment, deployment, out there into the Badlands, onto the field of the battle, you will not commit war crimes. Otherwise, everybody in your unit will lose their dingle dangles and they will hate you forever. Because they're just as bloody scared as you and they're restraining themselves from shooting the sheep or the sheeples or the locals or the road signs because they're not selfish assholes. Okay, we're coming up to Anzac Day. Just as we're coming up to Anzac Day, President Biden announces that after 20 years of trying to occupy the graveyard of empires, Uncle Spam's going home because no Afghans were on the aeroplanes that crashed in America 20 years ago. No Afghans. They attacked and they occupied the wrong bloody country twice because there were no Iraqis there either. So America's going to take its explosive bat and box of hand grenades back home. So Australia's last 80 military personnel who are over there trying to teach the Afghans how to fight because like as if they don't fucking already know how to fight. I mean, like Alexander the Great didn't get much past Afghanistan before he hit India and he died and his whole mob schismed, fragmented, fell to pieces. The British Empire fell apart and failed after it made a mess of itself in Afghanistan. 10,000 people and one survived the retreat march from Kabul. One out of 10,000. The Soviet Union, it got its ass handed to it on a plate in Afghanistan, and then the cost of running its military activities bankrupted the nation, or the collective of nations, the Soviet. And now America's backing out, so Australia's backing out. So we come up to Anzac Day, where we spent 9 months running uphill into machine gun and mortar fire. Didn't get much artillery fire because the sterling work of the aerial reconnaissance, spotting for the naval gunfire, which kept the Turkish artillery pretty much under control. But lots of machine gun fire, lots of rifle fire, lots of mortar fire, 9 months trying to run up a cliff into the gunfire, and we run away in the middle of the night just before Christmas. Okay, well, Australia's going to be out of Afghanistan by September 11. We're going to run away from Afghanistan just like we ran away from Gallipoli because the job could not be done, which meant that the whole 9 months beforehand was a complete fucking waste of time and money and effort and blood and lives and turmoil and trouble and tragedy. I think 15,000 Australians were casualties and 8,000 died on Gallipoli. 39,000 Australians went to Afghanistan over 20 years and 41 were killed there. And about 400 have killed themselves since they've come back here. Which is kind of a bit strange because the same week that we announced in Canberra that we were backing out of Afghanistan at the same rate as the Americans, they also announced a royal commission into veteran suicides, and they also announced that Brereton's recommendation, which had been accepted by Angus Campbell, has been overturned by Peter Dutton, who used to be Minister for Homeland Security or Internal Affairs in charge of ASIO, the top spy in the country. He's now inherited the defence portfolio because Christian Porter's in disgrace and there's had to be a cabinet reshuffle because of a 33-year-old rape allegation that he denies. Anyway, Dutton, the cashiered ex-Queensland police officer who was a serving member for about 9 years, I think, back in the days when Queensland used to have the highest deaths in custody rate of any police administration within the British Commonwealth of Nations. He's now our Minister for Defence. He's just bowed to the Liberal Party propaganda machine's pressure, and he has overturned the Brereton recommendation as accepted by the Chief of the Defence Forces, Angus Campbell. And a lot of emotive words have been used. One fella said that, if you want to take my son's meritorious unit citation away from him, you'll have to come and chisel it off his headstone. So it's all been stripped of any Gestalt, zeitgeist, national good, let's do the right thing for the sake of Australia's self-esteem on the international stage. No. We're just going to make individual people feel good about saying, I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything, I'm not going to fucking say anything. That's where we are as we go into Anzac Day. Now, that's my reading of the situation so that you can see whether I have given you a fair portrayal. Let's have a little bit of a look at what Rupert Murdoch's toe rag, the Australian, had to say regarding the entire situation. A little bit more caramel latte to wet the whistle. We have a Ben Packham story. Dutton pulls rank on medal ban. We have another separate Ben Packham story. Minister makes a decision of merit. And these two stories continue over the page. There is an op-ed with no name. We have a letter to the editor on slap in the face for our military. And we have another one on a futile war. Packham characters, their foreign affairs and defence correspondent. Australia's Special Forces veterans who served in Afghanistan will retain their meritorious unit citations unless convicted of war crimes or sacked for poor conduct. Peter Dutton, in his first major public decision in the defence portfolio, will officially overrule Chief of the Defence Force Angus Campbell's decision to strip the citations from more than 3,000 Special Forces soldiers as a collective punishment for the alleged crimes uncovered by the Brereton inquiry. Mr. Dutton will announce the move on Monday, just a week out from Anzac Day, declaring 99% of our ADF personnel serve and have served our country with distinction, the full Wehraboo. Mr. Dutton told the Australian the nation would remember the original Anzacs on April 25, quote, but my focus will be on those who have returned from recent conflicts, unquote. Quote again, we honour these young men and women and they will be wearing their unit citation medal with pride, unquote, he said. Quote, almost 40,000 honoured our country with their service in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I couldn't be more proud of their sacrifice. Oh, I didn't realise the 39,000 was reached by joining Iraq to Afghanistan, but anyway, bloody statistics and the way they're quoted and misquoted. I couldn't be more proud of their sacrifice. We honour them and their loved ones this Anzac Day, unquote. In a show of support, Mr. Dutton will visit the Special Air Service Regiment, the unit at the centre of the war crimes allegations, at Perth's Campbell Barracks on Monday afternoon. His ruling will mean soldiers will retain their unit citations unless they're found guilty of a war crime, are sacked as an accessory to an alleged crime, or dismissed for failing to uphold army standards. That's their get out. They're going to sack the bloody lot without proving anything. Are sacked as an accessory to an alleged crime. So you don't have to prove the crime. If somebody's accused of being an accessory, they can be sacked. That's my reading of that sentence anyway. Or dismissed for failing to uphold army standards. The Special Air Service Regiment's 2 Squadron, which was linked to the majority of the alleged war crimes, was abolished earlier this year on the Chief of the Defence Forces orders. But Scott Morrison put General Campbell's revocation of the unit citation on hold after an outpouring of anger from veterans and their families. Wehraboo, 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 Wehraboo. In one case, The father of a commando killed by a Taliban rocket attack said that if the CDF wanted to take his son's service award, he could collect it himself from my son's gravestone. Mr. Dutton's decision follows a distressing week for some veterans, with the decision to withdraw Australia's remaining troops from Absurdistan, along with those of the US, amid fears the pullout could pave the way for a Taliban takeover. The meritorious unit citation was awarded to Special Forces soldiers for, quote, sustained and outstanding warlike operational service in Afghanistan from 30 April 2007 to 31 December 2013 through the conduct of counterinsurgency operations in support of the International Security Assistance Force, unquote. Yep. Cleaning the toilet in the SAS Commandos compound. If you were there, you'd get that medal. General Campbell accepted Justice Brereton's recommendation in November that the citations be revoked, declaring, quote, units live and fight as a team, unquote. And he's been overruled by political bullshit artists. However, he faced immediate pushing back from veterans and politicians alike. A petition to overturn the decision attracted more than 50,000 supporters, while the Prime Muppet made it clear he was unhappy with the decision. Lawyer and former RSL, New South Wales President Glenn Colomites, who was attached to the Special Operations Task Force in Afghanistan in 2009 and 2010, described the move at the time as a knee-jerk reaction by those who are supposed to be strategic leaders. I'm happy to hand mine in as long as the senior leadership, who all got Distinguished Service Medals for their leadership, hand back their awards, he said. I agree with him there. He should hand his back in. And so should everybody in the chain of command, all the way up to bloody John Howard who put them there. Okay, that's the light print. We'll come back to the start of that after we finish this. I see, I got that one slightly... Well, yeah, let's say this is comment, even though that's the bit that's continued from page 1. Maybe we should go back to page 1 and cop that bit before coming to this one. It's terrible difficult. Yeah, I think we'll do this one first and then we'll finish on that one. So, same bloke. They try to make it look as if they've got balanced opinion by having 2 separate opinions on the front page, but they've actually got the same bloke going out twice. Peter Dutton stamping his authority on the defence portfolio by the day. His decision a week out from Anzac Day to allow Special Operations Task Group members to wear their meritorious unit citations, quote, with pride, unquote, will be welcomed by most Afghan veterans. Yeah, they all want to think and feel that they did the right thing and that their grateful nation has rewarded them duly for having so done. Chief of the Defence Force Angus Campbell's decision to strip the citations from more than 3,000 Special Force veterans as a mark of their collective responsibility for war crimes was always a flawed one. Wehraboo, 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 Wehraboo. Ben Packham, the Australian Army Wehraboo. Continued from the page 1. Justice Brereton's report for the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force found up to 25 Special Forces soldiers were involved in the alleged murders of at least 39 Afghan civilians and prisoners, recommending charges be pursued against 19 of them. Mr. Morrison said the government would ensure the actions of a small number of soldiers facing war crimes allegations, quote, do not reflect on the many thousands of others who serve today and who have served before. That is how we deal with these issues in Australia, according to the rule of law, the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, and in accordance with the administrative processes that operate within the Defence Force. Well, the administrative processes that operate within the Defence Force are set up, drafted, fine-tuned and enshrined in order to prevent the public recognition of any member of the Defence Forces ever having done anything wrong, because that would reflect badly on the Defence Forces. You see the problem with this, allowing the politicians to be massaged by the propaganda department of the army, who doesn't want to admit that they've ever done anything wrong, especially not the chain of command, who shut their bloody eyes to all this shit. Chief of the Army Rick Burr told a Senate estimates hearing last month 17 defence personnel had been issued a show cause notice asking why they shouldn't be sacked in relation to the Brereton report findings. 8 had since been dismissed, he said. A further show cause notice was issued last week to an army colonel after a pixelated photo was published by 9 newspapers showing him partying with junior soldiers in an unauthorised on-base bar in Afghanistan. That would be the series of still photos showing service personnel, including Ben Robert Smith, VC, the highest decorated living serviceman in Australia, partying, some of them drinking alcohol from the fiberglass artificial leg of a person that Ben Robert Smith had shot earlier on that day. One bloke was naked, another bloke was performing fellatio on a half-naked individual standing there. Another one was wearing a Ku Klux Klan outfit with a burning cross. They were a fairly disgusting series of photographs if these are supposed to be Australia's best of the best elite special forces, most honourable, most highly decorated super troopers. They sort of look like an out of control private boarding school football team on tour getting drunk. And the joke of it is that this colonel who got issued his show cause notice as to why he shouldn't be sacked last week, he's the particular individual who had been appointed by the chain of command who was so bloody horrified by all of the revelations of the Brereton report. He was the bloke who was tasked with reforming the culture of the special forces. If it wasn't for the photos that were posted by the newspaper and the TV station last week, this prick who was at the party with all of the murderous war criminals, getting drunk and laughing about it, he was the bloke who was supposed to be the front man pretending to reform the army. The now colonel, who was due to take up a key position overseeing cultural reform within Special Operations Command, is understood to be considering his options. Lieutenant General Burr will tell a symposium in Brisbane on Monday that, quote, good character and sound ethical grounding, unquote, are vital aspects of, quote, good soldiering. We create strong teams who actively include others and bring people together to be effective and achieve their mission, he will tell the event. Now we come up to the defence in industrial level denial. Peter Dutton is stamping his authority on the defence portfolio by the day. His decision's a week out from Anzac Day. I think we've heard nearly all of that. The Chief of the Defence Force, Angus Campbell's decision to strip the citations from more than 3,000 Special Forces veterans as a mark of their collective responsibility for war crimes was always a flawed one. The alleged murders of Afghan civilians and prisoners were, as Justice Paul Brereton found, committed and concealed by a small number of patrol commanders and their protégés. If there was to be some form of collective punishment, Special Forces commanders should have been at the front of the queue to receive it. Dutton's citation ruling was expected, but is still a blow for Campbell, who was treated deferentially by former Defence Minister Linda Reynolds. Dutton has rightly made it clear to defence personnel through this newspaper that the government has their back. If you go and commit war crimes, do your best to hush it up, and unless you really make it public, this government will back your hush up. So said Peter Dutton, first week in the job. Heightened security threats, including the possibility of a great power conflict over Taiwan, means Australia's servicemen and women must be ready for whatever lies ahead. In other words, if we actually punish the people who looked the other way for 9 years in Afghanistan, while our most highly decorated, glorious warriors were out there shooting the sheeples because they couldn't find any bad guys, maybe nobody will want to join the army and go and fight China because America wants to pretend that Formosa is Taiwan. Seriously? You think anybody is going to sign up to fight China to defend American foreign policy for the sake of a meritorious unit citation if they actually live long enough to come back home after fighting China to keep Taiwan from reverting to becoming Formosa. And this Ben packing shit feels so confident in his interpretation that he's put this into print, been paid to do it by Rupert Murdoch. Soldiers accused of war crimes are being investigated and will face prosecution if there is sufficient evidence against them. If there's sufficient evidence against them. So you're going to have to get Afghan witnesses to testify under oath in an Australian court. Yet unless Defence deals with the Brereton inquiry's broader ramifications, it risks long-term damage to its moral foundations and international credibility. Get to the bit that matters and bury it right down at the very bottom of the article. In the 5 months since the Brereton report was released, there has been stony silence from Campbell and Chief of Army Rick Burr on the issue of command responsibility. They were mugged by events last week when a 2009 photo emerged of a senior officer cavorting with junior officers in the unauthorised Special Air Service Regiment bar at Tarin Kowt. The officer is the first directly linked to a cultural decline within the elite military unit. Incredibly, he was scheduled to take up a key role leading cultural reforms across the nation's special forces. The now colonel has since been issued with a show cause notice to say why he should not be sacked. But why did it require the publication of a pixelated photo of the officer engaging in a simulated sex act? Okay, so the colonel who was tasked with social and cultural reform of the Special Air Services, he was the one either sucking the dick or getting his dick sucked in the photo. Really, I wasn't aware of that. That little bit of subtlety had failed to penetrate the haze of my patriotic nationalistic fervour. I didn't realise just how bad it was. By now, Defence should have vetted every still serving Special Forces officer who was deployed to Afghanistan to determine those whose conduct fell short of expectations. Instead, its senior officers are engaged in industrial level arse covering. Not denial, like the headline writer put, arse covering. So this Ben Packham, he knows what's going on. He's one of these shills who writes what he's paid to write, and he places a few little barbs deeply embedded in what he's paid to write in the hope that some people may notice. And I have drawn those barbs to your attention, that such is the state of reporting in Australia. Pretty much everything that this newspaper has printed strikes me as being a straw man. The idea that Wehraboo, so many served honourably and they didn't do anything, but they didn't speak up either. That seems to have been missed. The idea is, but they volunteered to be paid combat pay, tax-free, to go on to the other side of the world and shoot a bunch of strangers because they didn't understand what the strangers were on about or how they lived their life or what they were trying to do. I'm sorry, but if you're on a football bus touring another country and some of the people on your football tour get drunk and smash all the mailboxes along both sides of the street, all the way from the pub back to the motel where they're staying. It's not just the people who smashed the mailboxes who are punished when the team gets back from the tour. Everybody who was on that tour gets tarred with the brush of odium of having been associated with the mailbox smashers. You can't give 3,000 people a meritorious unit citation for officially not paying attention when corporals, lance corporals and warrant officers were taking their patrols out to shoot the local civilians because They were full of adrenaline. They thought they were going out to have a firefight with the bad guys, and there weren't any bad guys around, so we'll just, I don't know, fire off a couple of boxes of ammo at these pricks over on that hill there. That'll be fun. And the stakes are slightly higher because Ben Robert Smith works as an executive for Channel 7 television. His boss, Kerry Stokes, has apparently lent him $1.6 million of Channel 7's money to pay his legal defence costs because he's up on war crimes trials. And to complicate it still further, Kerry Stokes is, I think, chairman of the board of directors of the Australian War Memorial, which is currently mired in controversy over its apparently politically correct decision to desecrate the Shrine of Remembrance or the Hall of Remembrance in order to come up with some digitised, upgraded, computer-hooted, interactive depiction of war that pleases Kerry Stokes, which will feature Ben Robert Smith, Australia's most highly decorated living military veteran. And of course, Scotty from marketing, the Liberal Party Prime Minister in a nation where the Liberal Party's only liberties they care about are the liberty to trash the environment and exploit the workers. And to expect everybody to stand in neat straight rows and salute the flag and do as they're told and think about nothing other than what they're going to buy next. Kerry Stokes has power politically because he owns a TV station. Morrison's scared of that. Dutton, the cashiered cop from Queensland. He likes people standing in neat straight rows with shiny shoes, with their hands by the seams of their trousers. What the bloody hell do you think your trousers have got seams on them for, if not to show you where to put your hands when you're on parade, son? An attempt at the compulsory paramilitarisation of Australian politics by endless invocation of patriotism, and it's kind of all fallen apart for them, you know. Their most decorated veteran, the accused war hero, with heels of clay. Their elite special forces teams had to disband a squadron of them because of the war crimes they committed. So anyway, let's just plough on. We'll read the editorial. After less than 3 weeks, Defence Minister Peter Dutton's making a positive mark in his portfolio. Mr Dutton's decision that Special Forces veterans who served in Afghanistan will retain their meritorious unit citations unless they're convicted of war crimes, very difficult, or sacked over their conduct in relation to alleged murders, pretty bloody easy, will draw widespread respect across the ADF and beyond in his dreams. And in making that call, the Minister has overruled the Chief of Defence Forces, Angus Campbell. In November, General Campbell said Special Forces Task Group soldiers would be stripped of their unit citations as a collective punishment for alleged crimes uncovered in the Brereton report. As Mr Dutton says, 99% of our ADF personnel serve and have served our country with distinction. There is no good reason why the majority of Special Forces who face dangers and privations most of us cannot imagine should be stripped of well-earned citations because of the heinous behaviour of a minority. The fair go principle needs to be applied. Yes, the fair go principle requires that if you see a member of your unit shooting civilians for the fucking fun of it, you dob the bastard in as soon as you get home. Ideally, you should plug the prick while he's doing it. Because when an Australian service person on deployment shoots a civilian to make himself feel better, it makes all 25 million Australians look like shit on a stick. Wehraboo, Wehraboo, Wehraboo. The meritorious unit citation was awarded to Special Forces soldiers for sustained and outstanding warlike operational service in Afghanistan from 30 April 2007 to 31 December 2013. Through the conduct of counterinsurgency operations in support of the International Security Assistance farce. In November, General Campbell accepted the advice of New South Wales Supreme Court Judge, not Australian Federal Court, New South Wales Supreme Court Judge, Paul Brereton, after a 4-year inquiry, not a 6-year inquiry, Took 6 years to get it set up. That the citations be revoked for 3,000 recipients declaring units live and fight as a team. The Brereton investigation found, quote, credible information that up to 25 serving and former soldiers were involved in and covered up alleged war crimes in Afghanistan. No, 25 were involved in. It was the rest of the fucking unit who covered it up. Alleged war crimes in Afghanistan. These included the alleged murders of innocent farmers, 2 adolescent boys, and compliant prisoners. But Scotty from marketing wisely put General Campbell's revocation of the MUCs on hold. That's Meritorious Unit citation. After an outpouring of anger and boo-hoo and sob and moan-groan and whinge and whine and tear me hair out and wear sackcloth and ashes from veterans and their families, and a petition that drew 50,000 signatures. 25 million people did not sign the petition. In support of the veterans, as Ben Packham reported at the time, Felix Solomon Sher, father of Private Gregory Michael Sher, a commando killed by a Taliban rocket attack. Anecdote. One anecdote. Oh, one man's upset because his son wanted to wear that medal in his grave. This is bullshit. You don't make policy decisions that affect the entire nation's defence forces in order to placate one grieving parent. This is not fucking Hollywood making a movie about the saving of Private Ryan. Michael Sher. Felix Solomon Sher, father of Private Gregory Michael Sher, a commando killed by a Taliban rocket attack, said if General Campbell wanted to take his son's award, he could collect it himself from my son's gravestone. Oh, what an emotional thing for a Murdoch journalist to say. The Australian has argued consistently that if members of Australia's elite special forces committed war crimes or atrocities during our longest war, which will finally end after 20 years in September, they deserve to face the full weight of the law. The Brereton inquiry began in May 2016. Justice needs to be done and seen to be done as soon as possible. Where appropriate, charges should be laid and trials held. As we editorialised in November, this century our wars have been fought exclusively by volunteers. Most have upheld the finest traditions of the Australian Army. Those who have not must be held to account. We support the ADF leadership in restoring ethical standards. Barbarism in the defence of noble values is unacceptable. So why is the Australian backing Dutton, reversing the Brereton-Campbell decision and giving the medals back to the people who sat like the 3 monkeys of corruption and pretended nothing was going wrong? All because you don't want to rock the boat. You've got to get promoted, and you get promoted by shutting up and saluting the flag, mate. Mr Dutton is making it clear to defence personnel, particularly in his decision ahead of Anzac Day, the government has their back. Yeah, well, Hitler had the SS's back too. He's made it clear he expects defence to focus on its core business and not on progressive social posturing. So morals and ethics is progressive social posturing, according to Peter Dutton, the cashiered cop from the Queensland Police, who served back in the days when the Queensland Police had the highest deaths in custody rate of any of Britain's Commonwealth of Nations administrations. Why does that not surprise me? He has also made it clear he expects defence to focus on its core business and not on progressive social posturing. In view of rising regional tensions over Chinese aggression, like wanting to be in charge of the South China Sea because it's off the Chinese coast, not off the Pacific coast of Norte Americano, including the possibility of a great power conflict over Taiwan. This makes eminent sense, so they say. It is also the reason the grave allegations in the Brereton report released 5 months ago need to be tested in court and culprits dealt with. For the sake of national security, the matter must be resolved if morale is to be restored. There is no place for war criminals in the ADF, but revoking citations for a hard job well done by our best forces was not in the interests of the ADF or the nation. Well, I've got to say that I respectfully disagree strongly. I think everybody who was in the special forces in the country of Afghanistan at the time had heard rumours. I just don't believe that they were so incompetent, so dull. Their eyes were dull, their heads were flat, they have no brains at all. I don't believe they're that dumb. I think ignorance and unintelligence and not noticing are absolutely not credible excuses for having looked the other way. It's just bullshit. 7 years, 2007 to 2013. I fully agree that the upper echelons of the chain of command were equally as guilty as the troops. Got to punish the bloody lot of them. Now, should we deal with suicide? Fuck it. Why not? They announced a royal commission into the suicide of serving and veteran military personnel. Because, yeah, more people have committed suicide after coming home from serving in Afghanistan than died on active service in Afghanistan. It's a very, very interesting thing. But according to the United States Department of Veterans Affairs and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare Statistics, there is no difference in the suicide death rate of military veterans compared to combat veterans. No difference in the suicide death rate between military veterans and combat veterans. Apparently, whatever trauma it is that drives people to suicide is not encountered on deployment during fighting in a combat situation. Either it happens during the deliberate, forceful depersonalization, brutalization, and reprogramming as a raw recruit during basic training, or the traumatic hardwiring had already occurred long before that individual joined the military. But the military and the combat veterans, both of them, have only twice the background suicide death rate of the population from which they are drawn. If you want to get into looking at who has a higher suicide death rate than combat veterans or military veterans, the children of combat veterans, they exhibit 3 times the society's background suicide death rate. Apparently, growing up with a combat veteran as a parent, in some cases, means you grow up in a war zone. You are traumatized from infancy. What is worse than that? Well, before the Equal Marriage Opportunity Act, or whatever it was called, the Same-Sex Marriage Act, before then, in New South Wales regional country towns, being a same-sex attracted teenager, that carried 6 times the background death rate of being a teenager in that town if you were not same-sex attracted. 6 times the death rate from suicide, and that happened between age 15 and 25. 3 times the suicide death rate if you're a child of a combat veteran. Twice the background suicide death rate if you're a combat veteran. Child of a combat veteran has a higher suicide death rate than a combat veteran. What's the highest suicidal death rate afflicted population in our society? Survivors, in air quotes, of childhood sexual assault. According to Melbourne University School of Medicine long baseline life outcomes research project, studied the life outcomes of 2,000 survivors of childhood sexual assault, starting from 1965 to 1985 and continued on to 2005. And they crunched the numbers for 5 years. And in 2010, on Valentine's Day, the ABC Radio National News Bulletin, from 6 o'clock in the morning, might have been 5 o'clock in the morning, till 1 o'clock, every bulletin carried the story. Survivors of childhood sexual assault in Australia demonstrate 18 times the background society's suicidal death rate. 1,800%. Not a piddly little twice as many like combat veterans and military veterans. 1,800%. Those childhood survivors of childhood sexual assault, they also demonstrate 48 times the accidental drug overdose death rate. And their deaths, whether by suicide or by accidental drug overdose, they tend to cluster 18 years after the abusive event. And seeing as the neurophysiologists and neuropsychologists say that your brain doesn't finish growing till you're 25, there are people who are saying that really you don't become an adult till you're 25. So let's say that you're a child until you're 25. So pretty much anybody who's suiciding 25, 35 plus 8, 42, 43, anybody who suicides under the age of that, you can look back 18 years and were they raped perhaps? Did something frighten the shit out of them and make them think that they were going to die and they were powerless? Did something overwhelm their amygdala and their hippocampus and permanently damage their neurocircuitry? Could it be that the people who are sexually abused as children see the world as a terribly threatening place filled with evil? Could it be that they are driven by a burning desire to fight against that evil when they grow up? Are they the people who decide that they want to become police officers and serve in the defence forces in order to go and suppress the wicked, evil, bad things? Could it be that the people who are suiciding after being in the military are merely survivors of childhood sexual assault who have been drawn to the military because the whole ethos of public service to defend the nature of your social reality from the forces of evil, which is what the military runs on, it's what the police run on, that is attractive to them. And if that hypothesis holds water, such individuals would be the ones who are precisely the least able to deal with the stress accrued in the job. Somebody who grew up in a happy childhood, in a well-adjusted home where nobody ever tried to sexually abuse them or physically abuse them or verbally abuse them, they may be emotionally and intellectually robust to the degree they can cope with the stress of being in the military and killing strangers because their national honour depends that somebody has to die in a ditch in the middle of nowhere beside a crossroads that nobody'd ever heard of. But if you've got a big chunk of scar tissue at the centre of your self-esteem and you've been covering it up with band-aids ever since you can remember, maybe the extra stress of being in a war zone trips those people out, pulls the scabs off. And furthermore, perhaps having lived in an absolutely regimented, structured environment where they don't have to worry about where their clean clothes come from, they don't have to worry about where their next meal's coming from, they don't have to worry about providing themselves with a bed because they sleep in the barracks or the bachelor officers' quarters. Just perhaps, maybe, when those individuals who have coped with their shitty childhood by volunteering to join the military and be paid to be told what to do every minute of every hour of every day, maybe when they come out of the military and all of a sudden they have to think for themselves, maybe that's a stress that's just too much for them. Maybe, perhaps, possibly. But, you know, as the recruiting song used to say, join the army, get your head shot off. But Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison between them have decided that Chief of the Defence Forces, General Angus Campbell, Chief Justice Brereton, they can go and fuck themselves, because justice doesn't matter in the Australian Defence Forces. Justice doesn't matter to the Liberal National Government in Canberra. What matters to them is marketing jism and publicity and propaganda. That's what matters. Marketing jism. All of which is roughly enough to give diarrhea the shits. But that's how it all looks. Smooth. Very smooth. That's how smooth it all looks to the fool on the hill. I wonder how many of the rest of the 25 million will swallow Peter Dutton's pabulum of bullshit. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.